This episode brought to you by How to Write Manga, your complete guide to the secrets of Japanese comic book storytelling. Available wherever fine ebooks are sold.
The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions. Gamers dominate the tabletop and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Real men can only express their truest emotions with their fists.
Truer words were rarely spoken, Don. And very appropriate words, because tonight we're going to be talking about writing shonen manga. We did an earlier show about the history of manga. Today we're going to be talking about shonen, that would be boys, manga, and the art of writing it. And who better to have on than Jack Ward, famous lover of manga and admirer of all things Japanese, who has recently written a book called Write Shonen Manga. Welcome to the show, Jack. Wow, I could hear that spit take from here. Actually, no, folks, I'm sorry. Jack did not write the book. Where I'm just teasing Jack because of his famous, or rather infamous, feelings about anime and manga.
Mm-hmm. We're saving him for a shoujo episode.
Exactly. We're saving him for when we talk about girls' comics. In actual fact, the author of Write Shonen Manga is none other than yours truly. Yep, me, Rob Patterson. About a year ago, I sat down and I was doing some analysis of Japanese comics and storytelling structures used in Japanese comics. Some listeners might remember from about a year ago, I was somewhat obsessed with story structure. Well, this is kind of an offshoot of that. And as an end result, I kept doing research into, the way Japanese, tell their stories. And eventually I ended up with this giant pile of notes that I had nothing really to do with, because I'd just kind of been doing it for fun. And I thought to myself, well, I could turn this into a book. And then I thought, no, that would be a stupid idea. That would take far too much time. And then I did it anyway. And so 6 months later, here I am. I have recently published my first book on the subject of shonen manga and the art of writing it. And so now I thought I'd basically take this chance to talk about, what I learned during my journey, a little bit about my book, and just shonen manga, of course, in general, because shonen manga is awesome. So where should we start?
Thinking, you wrote a book specifically about writing shonen comics. Mm-hmm. And I think the obvious question is, why specifically shonen comics?
That's a very good question. The short answer is because manga is just too big a subject to try to cover with one book. I didn't feel comfortable trying to do a book called, Write Manga, which I think many people would have done, but I looked at it and said, well, the analysis I've done was done on shonen comics. And while I know something about shoujo and seinen and the other different styles of Japanese comics, the one I know best is shonen. And so I thought I would limit myself to just talking about the styles and everything of shonen comics. There's also another aspect, which is somewhat more mercenary, I suppose, which is shonen comics are the most popular of all of them.
Right.
And there is no type of comics probably in Japan that sells more than shonen comics.
Okay, except maybe pachinko comics for some reason, but...
Well,
Japan
that's true. Yes, okay, yeah. I mean, as far as I know, there are no specific genres that sell better than shonen. I mean, maybe, the pervy adult comics do, but, that's porn, so we're not going to we're going to put that aside. But as far as I know, the best-selling comics in Japan are shonen comics. I'm referring to, of course, Naruto, One Piece, Bleach, Dragonball. What else? What other famous shonen comics are there?
I think you could basically just say anything anybody's heard of in the last 10 years.
Well, almost, yeah. That would work, actually. Pretty much anything that you've seen that's been turned into an anime was probably a shonen comic.
Yeah. Now, how are you defining a shonen comic?
I'm defining a shonen comic as a comic for 8 to 14-year-olds, basically.
Okay.
Definitely done in the style of Shonen Jump, or Weekly Shonen Jump as we'd know it.
Right.
For those who aren't familiar, Weekly Shonen Jump is the top-selling manga comic book anthology magazine in Japan, which sells somewhere between 2 and 3 million copies a week. Mm-hmm. To give you a perspective, of course, your average Marvel comic right now sells 20,000 copies a month. Yeah. So it's a little bit of a difference. And it has and Weekly Shonen Jump, of course, also has competitors that are also selling in at least north of 1 million anyway copies a week, sometimes a month. And there are actually 4 Shonen Jump comics as well. Jump being the most popular of the different brands. So I'm defining Shonen comics as the style of comics that they do. I mean, I know there are other companies that do shonen comics, but generally they tend to fall roughly into the same category. Like, they tend to follow the same themes. They tend to circle around the same ideas. Mm-hmm. And this is actually important because there's actually shonen comics, which again are meant for 8 to 14-year-olds. Okay? Yeah. And then there are seinen comics, which technically are for more or less, they usually say 16 to 40-year-olds. I've seen different numbers, but that's where roughly where they put them. Apparently, if you're a 15-year-old, you're just SOL. Nobody loves you. You're not in Japan anyway.
Right.
Maybe in Alabama, but not Japan. Thanks, folks. I'll be here all night. So, yes. Basically, there's shonen comics, and then there's seinen, but seinen covers a huge swath of territory. And the trick with seinen is, even among seinen, there's actually different stages of seinen, right? Like the seinen comics for a 16 to 20-year-old are going to be different than the ones for a 30 to 40-year-old. Because they're going to have a very different sensibility and very different ideas. And in fact, I would argue that a seinen comic for a teenager is actually, in a lot of ways, most of them basically are the same as a shonen comic. They just have more gore and violence and sex and drugs in them. Like, shonen comics are relatively pure. Like, they might have a little bit of gore, they might have a little or a lot of violence in them, but they generally will not have much in the way of sex. I mean, sex in a seinen comic usually amounts to, like, checking out a girl's panties or something like that. There's some sexuality, but there's not going to be any actual sex. If you see actual sex, you're probably looking at a seinen comic.
Yeah.
And you're usually looking at one that's targeted towards we'll call it the young adult seinen comic.
Yeah.
Whereas shonen comics, to flip back, are generally targeted towards what we would consider the middle grade. Like, here we would call that middle grade fiction. That's kind of like where Harry Potter starts out. That's Percy Jackson and the Olympians. That's where you'll find a lot of fiction. Artemis Fowl, for example, another series. You'll find all that's targeted towards the 8 to 14-year-old set. Which, oddly enough, of course, is also where Marvel Comics and DC Comics have traditionally been targeted as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think your examples like Harry Potter and that. For myself, I find like the shonen stuff tends to be a lot more formulaic than, say, the seinen, and I think it's because, like you said, the seinen stuff is generally for a wider spread of audience.
It is, yes.
Because I think when you talk like your Percy Jacksons and that's pretty close to the shonen formula as well.
Yes, it is.
Like, that covers a lot of ground. The Marvel Comics thing of the DC Comics, I think, might be a little problematic as an example because they go through phases.
They do, you're right. I mean, there are times when they've been more for a younger audience than more for a slightly older audience.
Yeah.
So it does get a little problematic, although at their heart, I would still say they're shonen stories.
Yeah, I think...
and I'll explain why. There's a very simple example I can give with this. All right. So one of the ways that authors often talk about the difference between young adult stories, which are meant for teenagers, and middle grade stories, which are meant for roughly 8 to 12 to 13-year-olds, is that they will say this: a young person who's like only in that 8 to 13-ish range basically wants to fit into society, right? Okay? Right. And so they are actually looking for stories about how to fit into society and how to protect and preserve society. Okay, they're actually about preservation. They're actually about fitting into the existing system. They're about becoming part of the greater world. Okay, but mostly they're about protecting the world as it is. Whereas the psychology behind young adult, at least this is how authors approach it, and it seems to work very well, is the idea that teenagers, on the other hand, want to make their own world. They want to follow their own path. They want to chart their own direction. And they want a story where generally the character is actually disrupting the world and, if anything, remaking it in their image. Okay? And so this is why most young adult stories, Twilight, again, Harry Potter eventually, because Harry Potter starts as middle grade and ends as young adult because of the characters age out, as they say.
Right.
Those stories, there's a reason why many of them are post-apocalyptic stories, is because in the end of that story, they have reshaped the world. It's created a world that's kind of in flux, and then the main characters reshaped it through their will and through their efforts in a lot of ways. And so that represents the ideal for a teenager. Whereas, as I said, for young people, they're about preserving the world. So if you think about it, what do superheroes do? They preserve the world as it is. They're power fantasies about becoming part of the world and becoming part of the system and then being the best part of it you can possibly be. Which is also, I would argue, what shonen comics are doing as well.
It's interesting, because I think, when you put it that way, I think that's mostly right. But
Thank you.
Notice... You notice with the superheroes, though, and I think this might go with what you were saying about how, say, Harry Potter ages out, whereas, say, an American superhero is perpetual and can't, that'll change. That you'll go through, like, that applies very much to, say, the Silver Age. When you get to the Bronze Age, you start to see the stories go the other way, where it's not about preserving and it's not about like saving the world. It's about redoing it. And then we get into, I guess they called it the modern era, which would be like the 80s. It goes back to that. But then when you get near the end, when you get like the dark, gritty phase, it kind of edges again towards that stepping on society rather than maintaining and securing it. But it keeps doing that back and forth because, again, the characters are perpetual, and you get to that point where your audience has aged up, but you can't really take the stories that extra spot.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with that. And also keep this in mind, because you can't take the stories that extra step, and because the superhero world in superhero comics always has to be our world, with that little bit of superhero twist, that's one of the reasons why they can never truly be young adult stories, unless you do them as an alternate Elseworld story or something like that. But that was the whole point about What If comics that Marvel did for a long time. It's like, well, what if the superheroes really did change the world, or these events actually had real consequences, and that's what the What If story would be. Whereas in a regular superhero comic, it doesn't matter how many criminals Batman beats up. Gotham is always going to be a crime-infested place. And it doesn't matter if Reed Richards invents a million different ways to travel faster than light. There will never be real faster than light in the Marvel Universe except in the handful of a small number of secret people, because if they did, it would stop being our world. And you can't have that. Their world is not allowed to change. So I would say that they stay in that middle grade level out of almost necessity, because they can't move forward. They can't enter their true period of adolescence.
Yeah.
Because they're stuck always having to be just on the cusp. They're stuck there in that perpetual state where they can't take that extra step and actually change the world, because if they do, that world may no longer be relatable to the audience, or especially to new people coming in, and they don't want to risk it.
Okay, makes sense.
So that's my theory for American comics anyway. The Japanese, of course, sidestep this entirely by just making their stories serial. So their characters do change their worlds, which is not difficult because most of the time in a Japanese shonen comic, their world is not our world to begin with. That's why a lot of shonen comics are set in fantasy settings instead. If you think about it, almost all the major ones are usually set in fantasy settings. And that allows the author to play with certain elements, to focus on certain elements of the story and setting and ideas. And it also means they don't have to worry about that stuff. Now, they're very simple fantasy settings. That's a key, because again, they don't want this to be inaccessible to the audience. And if you give them a really complex setting, the audience might get intimidated. And
Right.
that's a big problem with these comics because they have to be accessible to almost anyone who picks up an issue at any point in the year.
Okay.
Anybody has to be able to pick up one of these weekly, whatever, the 50 or whatever issues that come out a year. I think it's actually only 47, something like that, because of different holidays, but whatever, that come out each year. They have to be able to pick it up and read it and kind of be able to follow the story and what's going on in that chapter. At least the basic ideas of what's going on in that chapter. Right. And the way they do that in its simplest form is by keeping the setting as simple as possible, usually. Again, it depends on the comic, but usually they do that. And keeping it character focused. So you need to just understand in a shonen comic that it's this character, they're these types of people, which they're usually the same types for especially the heroes. And this is the good guys, this is the bad guys, and they're fighting each other. Let's watch them fight. And go from there. And that's how most shonen comics are done. I mean, they're done, and this is something that people always forget, with this serialized idea in mind, that you always have to be available for new readers to jump in, and you always have to be doing something that can be really long or really short, depending on how well it's doing, and that you can change as you go.
Okay.
As you know well yourself, Don, from reading Bakuman and from other sources, generally most shonen authors only work about 3 or 4 chapters ahead.
Yeah.
Because they're constantly worrying about, well, how are the readers going to react? What's my ratings going to be in the next issue? And if I need to change the story.
Yeah, there's that, and I've also noticed that what a lot of the Japanese comics do, and they've done for a long time, it's similar to how the Europeans do it, but the Japanese do it sneaky. That they essentially write any one of the comics. It's a bunch of different chapters, and each chapter is kind of like a mini adventure.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's like that. The Europeans will do that, but they'll put it out as a volume.
Right.
And then that volume would be like a self-contained story. And they might do a next volume, which will be, it'll tie into the last one, but it'll be its own little thing. It'll be like a whole new story.
Right.
Whereas the Japanese seem to do that too. And it's that idea that it gives you more jumping in points for new readers. And if the book gets canceled, you can kind of end it without it just stopping.
Yeah, exactly. And they want to be able to have that flexibility. I mean, they want stories to be able to end that way, partly so that you can collect them later in volumes and make more money from them.
Yeah, because that's one of my kind of pet peeves is a lot of newer stuff you can tell is written for the collections.
Oh, it absolutely is. It's absolutely written with the idea that the collections are usually 8 chapters, 8 episodes, whatever you want to call them, per volume. All right? And so they write them with this rhythm in mind, where the volume is building up as it goes towards some big event that'll happen at the end of that 8th chapter, and that forces you to come back and read the next volume, to buy the next volume, basically, to continue the story. So we're looking at these cycles where each chapter is leading you to the next one. It's actually setting it up so that you have to read the next one to find out exactly what happens next, usually. And then the 8th one is a really big cliffhanger to make sure you buy the next book.
Yeah.
And so they never finish anything, usually, within a volume. A volume will almost always end on a cliffhanger of some kind, or a suspense note, basically, unless it's the very last volume of the whole series, usually.
Yeah. And then that leads to a lot of, I've seen a lot of the pacing will be off because they'll put an extra chapter in to fill it out to that 8, but that chapter won't quite tie into the main story. Sometimes, yeah. Yeah. And sometimes they'll go back and add extra chapters, as you said, or they'll add extra pages. One person, the guy who does Onepunch-Man, Murata, I'm trying to remember what his first name is, but whichever, he actually is kind of infamous for that, where he does a whole chapter of Onepunch-Man, and then when the collection's coming out, he goes back and redraws a bunch of them and adds extra pages and mucks with it again. Yeah. So there's actually at least 2 versions of every one of his stories. Which is true, and some of them are very, very different. Yep. Yeah, he's really mucking around with them. Now, mind you, there's a catch. Some of them are actually, art-wise, are dynamically much better. Often he's just thought of a better way to draw it, so he went back and redid it in a cooler way, basically. Yeah.
So yeah, that dude is a monster. I mean, he's basically the Saitama of comic book artists. And I can actually prove it. So as of us recording this show, okay, we're about a day out from his next release of the next, we'll call it quote unquote chapter of One-Punch-Man, okay? And he does this on one of these live streaming channels. So he lets people watch him work. And so he has this little table, the hand-scribbled table that he keeps next to him with checkmark boxes indicating how many pages are going to be in each chapter. All right? And the next chapter that's due out tomorrow is 137 pages.
Uh-huh.
You have to realize something. He put out the last chapter less than a month ago.
Mm-hmm.
That dude just did 137 pages of manga art in 1 month. Now, our audience, for those who are not familiar, might not quite comprehend what I've just said. A normal manga releases 16 to 18 pages a week. All right? So it is doable. I mean, let's just round it to 20 for fun, assuming there's a splash page or whatever else is there. So a normal manga artist might release 80 pages a month. Okay? Murata just did 137. Okay? And that 20 pages a month, that's done with a whole team of assistants, which Murata does have.
Mm-hmm.
But still, that's an insane level of productivity. His normal releases for One-Punch-Man are only usually between 30 to 50 pages tops for once a month.
Right.
And this time he did 137. And nobody knows exactly why he did 137, but for whatever reason, that guy has decided to do it. He is literally a monster manga artist. Yeah. Like, he's astounding what he's capable of. But anyway, we should probably go back to talking more about manga itself. So manga first appeared, just to give a quick history for those who missed the history lesson, and a little more specific one. Shonen Manga first appeared about I believe it was 68 is when Shonen Jump premiered. Yeah. There was Shonen Manga before this, I mean, obviously for young boys, but Shonen Jump is kind of like the Marvel Comics of manga. They're basically the ones that do it best and have kind of set the standard for how everyone else does it. Yeah. When they first appeared, of course, they were a variety of stories, mostly like racing stories and some gang stories and some martial arts stories and, adventure stories and a mix of stuff. And with each decade, they've changed. In the 1970s, I believe Shonen Jump was actually the home of Mazinger Z and the giant robot revolution that would come in the very early 70s. Yeah. I'm pretty sure that it premiered in Shonen Jump. And then they would go on to do many other things. Eventually, they would be involved with kind of the action hero genre of the late 70s and early 80s. There was also the gang story genre, which was really popular for a little while there during the 80s as well. That's where you get these roving bands of schoolboy toughs that like banded together to beat up other gangs of schoolboy toughs. That was a really big genre for a little while there.
It was, wasn't it?
It was. Also sports stories as well. We got Captain Tsubasa, which is the famous Japanese soccer sports drama. I believe might have been a Shonen Jump comic as well. I'm not 100% sure on that, but it was definitely a shonen comic anyway. And there were various sports dramas that took place in shonen comics. And so they've slowly evolved over time. And then once we got into the 80s, of course, we got Dragon Ball itself. Yeah. And Dragon Ball revolutionized everything. It transformed the world of shonen comics by being so massively popular that it increased the sales of Shonen Jump by millions of issues. Millions by itself. Millions. It increased their circulation. And so, as an end result, Dragon Ball kind of set the standard for what shonen comics would be ever since then. Like, ever since it first appeared, it kind of changed everything, especially once they got to what we call the Dragon Ball Z phase, which has been pointed out that actually Dragon Ball Z is just a label for the anime. The original Dragon Ball in the original form is just called Dragon Ball for its entire run. Mm-hmm. But what we call Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, or differentiate between the two, is when Goku is a kid and when Goku is an adult. Yeah. When he's an adult, it's Dragon Ball Z because that's what they call the animated version to differentiate it. But the actual comic book itself just has a time jump and doesn't actually change the name. At least that's what I read anyway.
Yeah, they change it for the show, I think, because what ends up happening is Goku's the main character, but Gohan becomes kind of like his son. Becomes he ends up becoming the main character. At one point, the focus shifts to him, and for the animation, I think when you get Gohan coming into the story is when they start calling it Dragon Ball Z.
So it's basically the next generation at that point.
Yeah.
That's a good way to look at it. Yeah, okay, yeah.
And like the comic didn't do that. The comic just continued on and on and on and on.
I apologize to Dragon Ball fans. My Dragon Ball knowledge is spotty. I haven't read all of it. I've read chunks of it, but I haven't read all of it. It's one of those comics that... There's a lot of Dragon Ball. There's a lot of it.
There's only, 100,000 volumes or something?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm afraid I'm not as versed in my Dragon Ball as perhaps I should be, but I do know the standards that it set very, very well, because especially with Dragon Ball Z, which was mega super popular, that became what basically became the template for what I refer to in my book as the battle manga, which is what I call a meta genre, which is a meta genre is basically a kind of not just a genre like horror or sci-fi or comedy or whatever, but it's this kind of type of story that can actually, you can do any other genre with it. You can kind of stick other genres into it and use that as kind of the formula or structure to tell those genre stories. Like, for example, with Dragon Ball basically set the standard. Dragon Ball Z specifically sets the standard where we introduce this, young martial arts hero, and then we basically watch him grow and go through different phases of his martial arts career and grow and develop. And it set the story in such a way that everyone else who came after would follow basically these certain milestones or these certain steps that it would go through.
They would copy the damn Dragon Ball formula. That's just, it's Dragon Ball. It's all just... It's
all Dragon Ball, exactly.
Yeah, Dragon Ball perfected that. Like, nobody's been able to crack that code since.
Oh, I would argue if you have. I mean, we've had One Piece, for example, and Naruto both have actually done an excellent job of cracking the Dragon Ball formula and actually, almost perfecting it in a way.
Yeah, kind of, but they do it by basically being Dragon Ball again.
That's true. That's very true. There are different takes on it, though. I mean, they are trying to do something. I can't say different with it, but they're trying to do something with it.
Yeah.
But anyway, so in my book, actually, I defined battle manga since I brought this up. Here's how I came to define battle manga: a battle manga is a story focused on a small group of characters in a high-stakes situation, fighting a series of clearly defined competitive personal duels in a limited space. That's my hyper-specific definition, or hyper-general definition, depending on your point of view, of a battle manga. And you might wonder why I say it that way. So let me just repeat that. A battle manga is a story focused on a small group of characters in a high-stakes situation, fighting a series of clearly defined competitive personal duels in a limited space. All right? So the reason I set it up that way is after reading a great amount of battle manga or that follow this formula, I've noticed that this is basically a way to describe how almost all of these stories work to one degree or another. So we have a relatively small cast engaging in a series of duels, obviously, because they're fighting, right? There are two types of battle manga. One are called activity manga and one are called fighting manga. Dragon Ball is basically the archetypal fighting manga. Okay, right. Which it's about people beating the crap out of each other. That's what they're doing. All right? And they're doing it under a clearly defined set of rules, okay? Because the audience has to be able to follow what's going on and do it in a very simple way. All right? The rules themselves are also adding an element of drama to the story, like they're limiting what the character can and can't do. Right. And so, for example, the characters are often working within the rules to try to get some advantage. Or the bad guys are often twisting the rules or breaking the rules to get some advantage. But there's always rules. There's always a definition to the way they compete. It's always a defined set of structure, of some kind, okay? And, of course, there has to be high stakes because if the characters are doing it because they want a piece of pie, that can be entertaining, but it's not going to be taken very seriously by the audience. So there has to be high stakes in some way. And finally, they have to be doing it in a limited space of some kind because the characters have to constantly be being pushed together by the circumstance so that they're constantly in jeopardy and there's that constant sense of drama and bad things could happen and the good guys can meet the bad guys at any time and they're constantly like next to each other so that the drama is intensified. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And that's, when you explain it like that, you hit on one of the things that I think, and I've seen this mentioned by other people, that marks an earmark of what makes a shonen comic as opposed to another type, is I've heard that one of the keys of a true shonen story is it's about camaraderie.
Yes, it is.
And that's why you usually have a small team of heroes, and they're always bumping into each other, and there's usually some kind of conflict, but it's about how they stick together, and it's about the bonds that form between them.
Absolutely. And in fact, actually, Shonen Jump has a motto that all Shonen Jump comics have to follow. Okay? I don't know if you
Dragon Ball.
Well, besides that, that's one of the mottos. The other motto is 3 words: friendship, effort, victory.
Yeah.
Friendship, effort, victory. All Shonen Jump comics have to follow those 3 words, or that idea, that conception in some way. They all have to represent those things in some way. So they're all going to be about characters who, through friendship and effort, manage to achieve victory.
Yep. Yeah, because that's one of the things that differentiates, say, shonen from the shoujo stuff. The girl stuff, at least up until the 90s, the girl stuff was always about an individual and her personal journey. It wasn't about the other people in her life so much.
Right, yeah. Yeah, you're right. I can definitely see that. Whereas when they did the Sailor Moon stuff starting in the 90s, that was basically them applying the Dragon Ball... No, actually, that wasn't the Dragon Ball formula. That was another formula, but them applying one of the shonen formulas, the boys' formulas, to girls' comics. Yeah. And they basically took that and said, okay, well, let's use the formula we're using for all our Sentai shows, the Power Rangers type shows, which is another formula that they use, which is a little different than battle manga, believe it or not. It's actually slightly different. And then they took that and they said, let's do it with an all-girl cast. And ta-da, we had Sailor Moon.
Yeah, and then that became the big thing for like the 90s and that.
Yep, exactly. That became a huge thing. And Sailor Moon follows all of this traditional Sentai, stereotypes right to a T. Like it's with just this like shoujo's twist to it. Yeah. And the only thing is, I will say that if you read modern shoujo comics, they actually still are mostly about an individual. It's only the stuff meant for younger girls, oddly enough, like the stuff that appears in Nakayoshi, which is one of the, if not the top shoujo or girls comic collections. There you will find action stories that are about groups, I've noticed. But if you go up to the girls comic stuff, which is their equivalent to seinen, which I'm trying to remember what it's called. There's a name for it.
Josei,
thank you. Well, if you go to Josei comics, then it will shift back to an individual girl trying to find her place in the world.
Yeah.
Probably because, again, that works better for a teen mindset, whereas a young girl, 8 to 14-year-old, is still trying to find friends and build her social group and is still trying to find her place in the world, just like a young boy of that age is.
Yeah, that, and again, kids are usually pretty selfish and self-oriented, so...
there's that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, anyway, that's definitely true. So that's battle manga. As I said, there are 2 kinds of battle manga. One is a fighting manga, which is generally about, people, beating the crap out of each other, and it's Dragon Ball, basically. Dragon Ball, One Piece, Naruto, those are all battle manga. The fighting ones. Then there's also another kind of battle manga, which I find even more fascinating, which is activity manga.
Right.
And they are still following the battle manga formula. They are absolutely still following this staged fighting as the character goes through their evolution as a character. But the trick with activity manga is it's not set around a fighting competitive art. It's set around usually something else. Like, for example, an activity manga will be about sports. It will be about cooking. You could literally do an activity manga about almost anything, and the Japanese have.
Yeah. Yes, they have.
You could do it about board games. That's what Yu-Gi-Oh! Is. That's what Pokemon is. I would argue falls actually into the activity manga category. Another thing, too, about activity manga is usually they're also about teaching the audience something about a particular subculture and about a particular activity. That's why I call them activity manga. So, for example, stamp collecting. You could do an activity manga about stamp collecting, where the characters are constantly competing with each other about who can get the rare stamp, or about who can recover a stamp, or things like that. And in the process, the audience is learning about the different kinds of stamps, and the different ink that they use, and the different paper they use, and which stamps are valuable, and which stamps aren't valuable. And, Hito has to quickly race out to Yokohama to get that stamp before his rival does. That they both just found out that there's a rare stamp has been spotted in this stamp collecting store. But when they get there, the stamp collector who's running the store will suddenly say, "Oh, both of you want this stamp, do you? Well, let's have a contest to see which of you knows more about stamps." And we'll suddenly be quizzing them on stamp-related collecting stuff. And,
oh, God, yes.
And Don's laughing because this is exactly how it works.
Oh, go ahead.
And it really is a formula. And you can do anything. You can do it with stamps. You could do it with growing plants. You could do it with fashion. You could do it with and they do. They use this freaking formula for everything.
And the funniest part too about it, and this is what I'm laughing at, the stylization and the imagery they use is the same as the fighting books.
Yep.
Because I've seen like crazy stuff, like the cooking things,
Oh, yeah.
where it'll be like, and who can make better pancakes? And they're using all these like dramatically lit like action scenes, and the guy will take a spatula and it'll be like a 2-page spread of just this guy like pointing his spatula at the other dude and saying, "My pancakes will be fluffier," and it looks just like a fighting comic, except they're making pancakes.
Yep.
Yeah, we never did that here. That's something I think we kind of missed out on.
I do think we did, because one of the things about activity manga is they're incredibly, when they're well done, they're incredibly, what's the correct word? They're incredibly, gripping in some ways. Like, I'll give you an example. The comic that actually first started me on this whole path of research was actually a comic called Robot X Lazerbeam.
Oh,
which I think even got mentioned in a previous show.
Yeah.
And which is the golf one. Look, I hate golf. Okay? Golf is one of those things that I find boring beyond all belief. To me, it's like watching paint dry. Golf is the most boring thing ever. But I started reading this golf manga called Robot X Lazerbeam, or whatever, that started about a year ago in Shonen Jump. I can't stop reading it. It's the most fascinating thing ever. They made golf the most, and I was reading it and I'm going, why is this thing so compelling? Why do I have to keep reading this? Why can't I stop? And I ended up throwing myself into this research partly because I wanted to know why I was finding this damn boring golf comic so fascinating and couldn't stop reading it. And the answer is because it was still using the same formulas that all the fighting stuff was. They're still using the same styles. They're still using a lot of the techniques of drama that a lot of the fighting stuff is. And they managed to spin it in just such a way that it actually makes it really interesting. And so, yeah, it's Robot X Lazerbeam's fault. That's really what this whole book is the fault of. It pretty much is. Yes, I've been reading manga and watching anime for like 30 years, but it really comes down to Robot X Lazerbeam. That's the one I blame.
You know what's really weird about that?
What?
There was another golf comic that I remember from the 80s. I don't remember the name. The only thing I recall, the one guy had his lucky like far whacker. I don't know the technical names for the golf clubs. And it was the Frying Swallow.
You're kidding.
Because it was engraved on it, and they do the art, the super detailed realistic art, and it was Frying. And I think it was supposed to be flying, but
of course it was.
R's and L's in Japanese are the same sound. They don't differentiate them.
So they have a habit of writing R or L when they actually mean the other letter.
Yeah, or they're just randomly interchanging them. And because we had a discussion about that comic a long, long, long time ago. I don't know if you remember. and it had to do with Batman.
Okay.
Because, I don't know if you remember, we had a discussion, and it was, if you're comparing characters to see who is tougher, because I believe we were doing this for writing role-playing games back in the day. Mm-hmm. How do you decide who is tougher? Like who would win the fight, Batman or Kenshiro? Well, Kenshiro probably. But Kenshiro. It's the idea that when you deal with something like, say, a comic, there's two realities you have to take into account, and that's what you're looking at and what the idea behind it is. Because Batman is supposed to be, he's not the top hand-to-hand combatant in the DC universe, but he's up there.
Yes, yeah.
I think like Gold Tiger is the only guy who's supposed to be tougher than Batman in a fight.
I believe there's a character called Richard Dragon who's actually supposed to be number one in the DC universe.
Okay, we might be talking about the same guy.
No, because... Wait, no, you mean Bronze Tiger, but Bronze Tiger's a black dude, whereas Richard Dragon is a white dude who managed to, like, master, like, every martial art in, like, existence or something like that.
Okay.
They introduced him a little later on, so maybe you're not familiar with him. But anyway, sorry.
But you get that idea that these are the top guys.
Right, yeah.
Now, the way American comics are drawn, they tend to be kind of matter-of-fact art-wise, even with the action. Mm-hmm. But then you go to say, like, to compare that to a Japanese character, you have to take that idea into account because Japanese comics are always, the action is very overdrawn in most of them.
Yeah.
And we talked about this golf comic because you would have these scenes where he's, like, doing his far shot, whatever the hell they call it in golf. And it'd be this wind up and, like I say, these 2-page spreads of the guy. And it just looked like the universe is coming to an end when story-wise, he's just making his shot.
Yeah. Yeah.
But visually it's crazy, and you look at that, and if you compare that just visually to like an American comic, like that club would just knock Batman into like the Marvel universe, like really. Yeah. And it's that idea, that conceptualization, and then that's why I find it funny when you talk about the activity-oriented comics, because they're all like that. It doesn't matter if you're playing chess. That moving that chess piece, that just looks like the world is coming to an end because they're so going to exaggerate the action.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, that's exactly what they'll do. And through that exaggeration, through that these cinematic techniques they use in manga, they manage to bring everything to life, they manage to give it a kind of hyper reality that makes it fascinating and interesting no matter what it is, even if it's freaking stamp collecting or growing plants or golf or whatever. They manage to bring it to life. And that's one of the things that just absolutely fascinates me, both because they do it on a story level and they also do it on the art level. And they make it work in such a way that it all comes together into this glorious piece of art.
I was going to say insanity, but whatever.
Oh, that works too. Yeah, insanity works too. Insanity definitely describes some of it as well. Yep. So this fascinated me, and I wanted to start doing more. And as I did more and more research, I just ended up with all these notes and everything. And so that's where my book pretty much came from. And so let's see. So there's battle manga, and they basically are either fighting manga or activity manga. But again, they're both generally following the same formula structurally, both short term and long term. Like they're both heading towards a very similar end. They both usually have some like character that represents like the main character is on a journey, and they basically have a final bad guy that they have to defeat at the end. It doesn't matter if it's a final stamp collector bad guy or it's a final martial arts bad guy. There's always going to be that guy at the end you have to defeat, and he represents the end of your journey.
Actually, you know what's funny? He represents something else too.
What?
Because remember we talked a while ago that a big difference between, say, American stories and Japanese stories is that Americans like the hero to be awesome to begin with, whereas the Japanese like them to build up to it.
Right.
That rival is usually awesome to begin with.
Yeah. Yes and no. I find that they are usually several steps ahead of the main character. Okay? So I would say the main character, if you want to do it this way, okay, the main character starts at 0, let's say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 100, okay? The bad guy usually, now this depends on the genre we're talking about, okay? If it's a fighting comic, like as in, martial arts stuff, the bad guy probably starts on a scale the bad guy probably is sitting up close to like 70 or 80 when the hero starts at 0, okay?
Right.
And that's kind of how it comes together. Whereas if it's an activity manga, I find often the bad guy, the hero will be at 0, and the bad guy will only be at about 30 on that scale. Because I find with activity manga, a very common trope is that when the bad guy, the rival, let's call him the rival, because it's better for activity manga. When he finally meets the hero, seeing the hero kind of reignites a flame that he kind of usually lost at some point, and then he starts accelerating very fast towards that 100, and the hero has to catch up with him. And then again, and then they eventually meet again at 100. But usually the bad guy is usually plateaued when he meets the hero. It's kind of somewhere in the middle of his development curve. And then meeting the hero, this is one of the ways that they actually kind of heighten the drama a little bit by the hero has inspired even the bad guy to actually work harder. And it make his own life more difficult in some ways.
Yeah, because the rival usually, they're starting with some kind of advantage. And that's what whereas like our hero is usually like the good, hardworking, average person. But the rivals, he has some kind of gift, or they're starting like they're the son of the last champion and they have all of that experience. It's something that to me a lot of times it feels like what they're doing is the rival has the unfair advantage.
Yeah, they always have the unfair, because if they didn't, it's not interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
They always have to have an unfair advantage.
It is, but it's specifically an unfair advantage.
Yes.
And then meeting the good, wholesome, hardworking hero, like you say, that kind of shakes them out of their funk.
Mm-hmm.
And it drives them to, a lot of times, I guess you say, to forsake that advantage and actually apply hard work, because hard work is the key. It's not like here where you are the chosen one and then that's all you need.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. Now, mind you, keep in mind that most shonen heroes of one kind always have an advantage too. Mm-hmm. They've always got some gift or some talent. Well, they've usually got two. One, they'll have a talent for hard work, that if they work hard, they can, they have they have a ton of potential, basically, they could reach if they only work hard, which they eventually do. Mm-hmm. And two, they usually have something that makes them special, like some extra little gift that, again, it has to be developed, it has to grow, but they still have it there to give them that extra boost that makes them different from everyone else.
Yeah, that and it usually starts as a curse.
Well, they often consider it a curse of some kind. Yeah, you're right.
That it's something they have to overcome and gain control of before they can actually capitalize on it.
Yes and no. I mean, it does depend on the comic. I mean, one could say that, for example, in One Piece, Luffy's ability to stretch is not a curse. The only curse that comes with it is if he drops into the water, he sinks like a rock. He basically become paralyzed because if you're a devil fruit user. But oddly enough, they don't really use that very much in the story. In fact, it pretty quickly went away. So that's not a big curse. But in the case of, say, Naruto, for example, spoilers, 20-year-old spoilers, Naruto has a giant demon fox spirit hiding inside him that is a curse. And is definitely trying to take him over and, do evil stuff at first until Naruto can eventually get control of it.
Yeah, there's a bunch. I'm thinking of Hikaru no Go.
Okay, yeah. He has that spirit, Sai, if I remember right. Sai. Yep.
And that gives him his advantage at playing. Yep. But Sai is one of the most whiny, annoying assholes ever. And that's the curse. So he won't let Hikaru just be his typical lazy kid self.
Well, that's exactly it. You have to have a quote unquote curse element to it, because otherwise the hero would just use that and kick butt. I mean, so there has to be some reason why the hero can't just use their gift to just be just like the bad guy and kick everyone's butt beyond them being a good-hearted person. Usually they have to find some way to get control over their abilities, which they only have limited control over at the beginning, so they have to work hard. Again, it's that effort business, remember?
Yeah.
Effort, friendship, victory. There has to be that effort. The character has to be working at something and working to achieve. And if they don't have to put effort into it, it's not going to work. It won't be a proper shonen story.
Yeah, it's the same thing like Bleach. Bleach was the same, that Ichigo could see spirits, but they mostly just irritated him because he didn't really care, and he didn't have the ability to do anything about them at first.
Yeah, at first, yeah. And then eventually he figured out, oh, well, I can do something about it. Well, if I remember right, he got Ruika's powers. Is it Ruika? I think something like that's her name, right?
Yeah,
I was never a big Bleach fan. But but yes, I mean, I like stories with backgrounds. Ooh. Anyway, so... Sorry.
20-year-old slam!
Exactly. Not 20-year-old. When Bleach first started, it actually did have backgrounds. But eventually the creator got so lazy, he just stopped drawing them after a certain point. And that was a horrific case of the background and setting really doesn't matter. It's all about the characters. Well, he took it to a new extreme. It was just characters fighting on a white background.
Yeah, it's true.
So anyway, so I found that there are actually a couple other kinds of shonen manga types meta genres that we could talk about.
Okay.
Another type are what I call procedural manga. And these are stories that are built around a character following some kind of procedural steps to achieve a goal.
Right.
A traditional example of this would, of course, be a mystery manga, where you have to follow the traditional procedure of you interview the suspects, you search for clues, you go through the steps, and eventually you find you get your result. Basically, you figure out who did it.
Right.
Procedural manga mysteries are not as popular as they once were. I mean, in fact, the only shonen one that I know of that still exists, actually, there's two. There's Detective Conan, which has again run since like the early 90s. Although I hear it's just about to end, actually. The mangaka, after like 20 plus years, has finally gotten tired of it. And there's also... Oh my god, I'm forgetting the name of it is just on the edge. It's not... there's Tantei Gakuen Q, which is one. Right. But there's another one. Oh, Kindaichi. Yes, Kindaichi. The Kindaichi Files. Which is another, similar to Detective Conan. Again, they're teenage detectives, basically, that, get involved in murder mysteries. And so they spend a couple chapters, solving a mystery with lots of weird stuff happening, basically.
Right.
Then the other kind I refer to are creative procedurals, which is basically a story, like, for example, right now one thing that's popular is the reincarnation genre, where a character will suddenly wake up in a fantasy world and they'll discover they're a goblin, for example.
Okay.
And a person from our world will suddenly wake up, discover they're a goblin, and they're like, holy crap, I'm a goblin in a goblin society. This is a real comic, by the way. It's called R.E. Monster. It's a real comic. That's what they call it in English, R.E. Monster. It might be called that in Japanese, too. And he's like, okay, I have human knowledge, but I'm a goblin, a baby goblin, in fact. What am I going to do? And it's about them basically figuring out the steps of how to fix their situation in this case. How to use their knowledge to benefit the world around them and to change their life and improve their life. That's a popular one. Another example of a creative procedural is Sword Art Online, lit RPG ones, where a character gets stuck in like a game or something like that and has to puzzle their way through how to finish this game and get out or beat the game or whatever. Popular one. And then there's my most favorite creative procedural ever, which is running right now, which is called Dr. Stone. And Dr. Stone... Well, Don, tell us about Dr. Stone.
Isn't that the one... It's a Boichi one.
Yes, it is. Obviously, you're not reading as highly as I am, but okay.
No, I saw like the first one. It's because at least it starts with it's like a disease that's turning people into statues or something, isn't it?
Not exactly. What happens is it's about a character named Senku, who's like the scientific genius. He's kind of like almost a Doctor Who level genius. And one day, suddenly, everyone gets turned to stone.
Okay.
Everyone in the world just bang is suddenly turned to stone one day, and no one knows why, including our main character. All right. Then like 20,000 years pass, basically, and then suddenly, thanks to certain circumstances, he wakes up. It's originally following his buddy, whose name I forget, and he wakes up and he's like, holy crap, the stone basically suddenly turns out to be a shell and it just falls off him. And so suddenly he's in this post-apocalyptic world surrounded by the statues of all these other humans, the ones that haven't broken or shattered over the years. And all of humanity. But, the world's all overgrown with plants now. There's animals around. Like, everything's gone back to nature. And so he's like, how do I use my scientific genius to restore civilization? And that's what he sets out to do from scratch. Okay. And so... dude, you have to read it. It is like one of the most awesome comics ever. It starts a bit slow, but once you get to the point where he finds, this is a bit of a spoiler, he finds a village of other people that have also, that may never have been turned to stone. They may be descendants, or they may be people who kind of thawed out earlier or something. We don't know exactly at this point in the story. And they're a lot of fun. And it becomes awesome at that point. It begins a little rough, but once he gets to the village, it is one of the most awesome things I have read in a long time. It's called Dr. Stone. And it is so much fun. And if you love Boichi's stuff, you really need to be reading this. Boichi is a comic artist that we're both a fan of. And normally he doesn't do shonen stuff. He mostly does seinen stuff. But I think this might be one of his very first shonen works, but... amazing stuff. Anyway, creative procedurals are about accomplishing some creative task, basically. Yeah.
And it's interesting, too, because you're right that a lot of them are really similar to the lit RPG stories that have been taken off the last few years.
Well, they're an obvious form of... actually, the lit RPG genre pretty much comes from Asia. We had Ramon on who talked about that. I'm trying to remember whether it was Russia or Asia. I'm pretty sure it actually started in either China or Korea. And the reason...
I think it was
Korea. Because even the Russian stuff... I've read some of the translations of some of the Russian lit RPG stuff, some of the early stuff, and they make references to... a Korean lit RPG story that was kind of the first one, I think, that everyone went crazy for, which was called Legendary Moonlight Sculptor. And which is about a character who has to literally start from the bottom and work his way up. But the trick is, in the case of Legendary Moonlight Sculptor, he actually kind of beat the game once before. But he's being forced to start again and use some of his abilities to actually... it gives him an advantage, the fact that he's beaten the game once before, at least in an earlier form, and then now he's got to start from scratch, and using that knowledge, what is the most strategic way he can go through it and beat the game in a new way and be even more successful.
Right.
And so he's got this creative procedure goal. And so I think it started with them, but now I've got to tell you that the... lit RPG and what's called the reincarnation genres are huge in Asia. Like the Japanese light novels especially, and a lot of manga these days are totally about the reincarnation genre, which basically is, as I mentioned earlier before, a character wakes up in the body of someone else, usually in a fantasy setting or another time or place, and then has to kind of just create a new life from there.
Yeah.
And it's become huge. Like super huge. I mean, almost every second story in Asia, China, Japan, everything is a reincarnation story these days.
Yeah, and it's weird because I hadn't noticed that until just now when you mentioned it. But holy crap, yeah, that is something that really has taken off. And
it's not just boys stuff, actually, girls stuff, especially in China, and that is all that too. My wife watches lots of Asian dramas, and every single frickin' drama is about some girl that basically falls off a bridge or something like that. And when she wakes up, she's in like ancient Korea or ancient China or something, or some fantasy land. And now she like meets a bunch of princes and has to hang out and decide. Eventually, they all fall in love with her, and she has to decide which one she's going to hang with. And that's like every second frickin' drama at this point. Like the reincarnation stuff is just. Like, it just took off to an incredible degree. Maybe even more so among women's stuff than men's, but the guys' stuff does it. They're two of my favorites that one I haven't read yet, but I am going to at some point, is, what is it called? Give me 1 second here, I'll tell you what it's called. Because I got to get the title for this one right. Okay, you'll understand what it is. Okay. So... Okay, one of them that I I have to read at some point is, so I'm a spider. So what?
Okay.
And here's the pitch for it. I used to be a normal high school girl, but in the blink of an eye, I woke up in a place I've never seen before, and I was reborn as a spider. How could something that's nothing more than a tiny spider, that's me, possibly survive in literally the worst dungeon ever? Are there no rules? There should be some rules. Who the hell is responsible for this? Show your face. That's an actual a light novel from Japan.
How could you resist?
How could you resist that? And there's another one that I'm very fond of, and it's called. That's the name of is totally escaping me at the moment, but it's basically about a girl who's a bookworm. Okay, and she one day her stack of books falls on her and kills her. She's like this middle-aged woman, okay, and she suddenly wakes up in a medieval fantasy society where the only books that exist are cost a couple gold coins and are like the most precious thing ever, and almost no one is literate, and she basically has to reinvent literacy and printing and bookmaking and everything. Oh, by the way, she's an incredibly feeble 4 or 5-year-old girl. So she's got the memories of her old self, but basically what's happened is, and this is an interesting thing about reincarnation, it's very common. The actual characters, the body that they're in, usually is someone who's died. So they die, and then they wake up in someone else's body, but it's almost like their spirit goes into someone else's body at the time that person died. And so when they wake up, they're almost always characters that, they've died, basically. But all people around them are like, oh my god, it's a miracle you're alive, but they don't realize that there's now another spirit living in that person's body.
That's kind of weird, because that was the one French comic we were reading. That's kind of a lot of like what that was about.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Echo.
What?
Echo, yeah, that was, member.
Yeah, that was kind of that idea, you're right.
That people who died in our world, those little squirrel guys.
Yeah.
The, Parisians, I think they were called.
We'll go with that.
Yeah, the little squirrel guys, you'd be reincarnated in this. It was basically the steampunk version of our world.
Yep, pretty much.
Except that the main character, the one main character, has the power that she can get possessed by the spirits of people who have died again, I guess, in this other world.
I guess that's the best way to describe it. So she's actually kind of like a spiritual medium in some ways.
In this altar world that you end up going to if when you die, these little squirrel guys decide to bring you across.
Yeah, well, they're about to die. If I remember right, because I did read it just a couple of weeks ago, they say they're grabbing people who are about to die. Like the main characters were plucked off a plane that was about to crash. So they're not actually dead. They're just they're grabbed away at the last second, so no one knows they're gone, basically.
Maybe, because I'm a few volumes in, and they haven't explained yet what that is. So it's possible that they do die in that other in like our world.
That's true.
But they're prevented from a true death. Like they haven't quite. They did draw attention to that, because there's the speech in the first one where she's talking about how everybody else in the plane is dead now.
Yeah.
But they haven't quite explained, and I wonder if that's going to be part of the story, because explaining why she gets possessed by people who have died in the other world.
Right. So we will put a link to that comic in the show notes, folks, so that you can go check it out. It's gorgeous. I have to say, the art in that thing is so spectacularly gorgeous. And it's a French comic, I believe.
Yeah.
Echo. All right.
And it's weird because, again, it's the same theme that you're seeing popping up in a lot of stuff for some reason recently.
Not sure why. I mean, I know that there have been characters obviously popping up or waking up in other worlds as a long staple. From Mark Twain wrote a story about that. But Connecticut, Yankee, and King Arthur's Court, if anyone's wondering. But this idea of suddenly reincarnating in another world. And then, but having all usually from our world, and then having all the information in your head from your life here, and then using that, kind of working that as your advantage, it's a new twist on it, or at least it kind of was 10 years ago. Now it's just everywhere.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what made them so focused on, but it does work. I mean, it's the ultimate fish out of water scenario. I mean, don't be surprised if we're seeing a lot of Hollywood movies using, or TV series using that trope, probably real soon now.
Yeah.
I can see that being one of those ones that slips over here pretty soon. So, and to me, that would be a kind of creative procedural. At least that's what I call them. Because in most cases, the character actually is faced with a task that's usually pretty clear from the beginning of carving out a new life, which usually involves solving some problem. For example, in the case of the spider one, I would assume that it's, all right, she's in a dangerous situation. How can she probably use her knowledge to maybe make friends and such and find ways to survive even in this super hazardous environment? In the case of
save the pig, save the world.
Save the pig, save the world. There we go. Maybe save the kobold, save the world. I don't know what. Probably again. So the characters use this knowledge from outside, and they use it to accomplish some goal in the story. And there's always a clear goal. Like for example, the bookworm story. She's trying to remake. She spends most of her time trying to reinvent printing and binding. Is actually what she's doing in the first part of the story. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. You can see what I'm talking about. There's a comic version. There's also a print version that people have been translating. That's a Japanese one. I find the Japanese ones are generally tend to be very creative. Like the ones that we're talking about, like the spider one, the goblin one. These are all Japanese ones. The Chinese and the Korean ones don't tend to actually go in these weird directions like the Japanese do. They tend to do things a little more straight up.
Yeah, well, I'd say the Japanese, not the correction, the Chinese and the Korean ones, straight up, I'd probably say more traditional, because they do sort of tie into that idea of karma and reincarnation. And a lot of the ones that I've seen anyway seem to be presented more in that classical kind of way.
Yeah, they are. They absolutely are.
And then whereas the Japanese ones are just like batshit crazy.
Yeah. Well, keep in mind, these are cultures that kind of believe in reincarnation to begin with. So that's not actually a big stretch for any of them to say, okay, you got reincarnated just but for whatever reason you got to keep your memories from last time. And that's the only hook, right? And that's gives you a connection with our world because you're relatable in some way now. And it also sets it up so that you're still that fish out of water and it also gives you an advantage at the same time. So it's a perfect setup in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
All right. And so the final major type, I should say, of meta-genres that I came up with were relationship manga that usually pop up. Relationship mangas usually tend to take two forms because you got to understand something, that boys of the 18 to 14-year-old set are not really interested in girls very much. And they're not really interested in reading stories that are directly about just relationships and people's feelings. You kind of have to candy coat it with something else. Girls will read stories about just people having relationships and talking to each other and showing their feelings and all that. Boys aren't interested in that. They're usually more goal-oriented. So, again, this is on average. I'm not saying every boy or every girl is like that. Some girls may actually very much be goal-oriented. That's true, too. But on average, at least based on the publishing experience of Shonen Jump, that usually doesn't quite work out. It doesn't quite work out so well if you try to do a straight relationship story with boys. So what they do is they candy coat it. And there's two different ways you'll see, usually I find. The first kind is what I call love comedies. Because even young guys appreciate, comedy, right? They appreciate a story where there's like some funny bits and usually some naughty bits and maybe a little bit of touching drama, but not too much because no one wants to be seen crying in front of his friends, of course. So, because that's not manly, and so so there'll be a love comedy, and love comedies, they're usually fairly simple ones, especially for the shonen level. I guess I would qualify Lum, for example, as a love comedy of this type. Ranma 1/2, and those are stories where they've got a weird element to them. Lum's case, for those who are not familiar with Yurusei Yatsura, it's a story about a boy who suddenly discovers he's got a new alien girlfriend, whether he wants to or not.
We've all been there.
Yeah. The crazy girlfriend. He wins a contest for the Earth, but this alien princess is his prize, and he doesn't realize that when he wins the contest. And so now, for the sake of galactic peace, or at least human peace, he has to live with this girl. And hijinks ensue.
Kind of.
Well, kind of, yeah, exactly. Hijinks ensue, shall we say? It's pretty funny. Then there's also Ranma 1/2, which I believe would still qualify as probably shonen, and sort of, which is again about similar story about another couple that's forced together. In fact, that's a standard love comedy thing. The main characters will pretty much always be forced to live together in one form or another, or at least they'll be forced into a very, again, going back to that battle manga formula. I call this the arena principle, which is basically that when you're writing a story, you should generally try to make sure your cast are stuck in a relatively small environment, so they're constantly having to interact with each other. Because you have to explain, well, if these people don't like each other, why don't they just leave?
Yeah.
And that's what the arena principle is, something you have to think about, is like, what reasons can I come up with why these characters just can't leave? Why can't they just walk away from each other? Because if the answer is they could anytime and they're just not doing it for any good reason, the audience isn't going to buy it.
Yeah.
And so you have these love comedies, and there are different kinds. There's like sentimental ones, like Orange Road, for example, which is just about a love triangle between a guy and two girls, and the guy happens to have psychic powers, but that's neither here nor there. Because again, shonen stuff, they like that extra little twist. There have been a few others that are just pure romantic ones. Like there was one called Eyes, which is written I''S. That was really big in the 90s, and that was I believe a very straight up, very touching kind of romance story. But again, it's a romantic comedy. There's still always going to be that comedy element to keep it kind of like lively in some way or another.
Yeah, because I think for your examples, I think Ranma 1/2 is the shonen version of it. Urusei Yatsura, I don't think is quite a shonen comic.
Right.
Because it kind of gets back to the quote that we started this episode with.
Okay.
And you know where that quote is from.
Where?
From probably the greatest shonen dramatic series ever.
Hokuto no Ken?
No.
Which one? Changeman Ken?
G-Fighter.
Oh, G-Fighter.
G-Fighter.
G-Fighter, okay.
Because that was there was a scene where Domon was arguing with the rest of the team, and like one of the higher up official guys said that to I think it was Rain that was complaining about why they're always arguing, and that was what he said. True men can only express themselves through their fists.
There we go. Yep.
And that's the idea, because for a lot of the shonen stuff, there's always that dramatic element. Because again, it's always about the feelings of the characters, and they usually put the romantic thing in, kinda.
Well, that's the thing, right? A lot of shonen comics, the female love interest character is usually just there to basically be cheesecake. In other words, to add some just to have a lovely girl wandering around, and to mostly just kind of encourage the hero, sort of. Yeah. I mean, they're really just a background element. Like, they really are. They're basically just at best supporting cast in most stories. Occasionally there'll be a motivator, but oddly enough, not usually. Because remember, these are written for boys 8 to 14, so the idea of the main character being totally in love with a girl and stuff is often kind of, ew, they're not really that into it yet. And so it's very common for the main character not to have any interest in the opposite sex, or at least they have a very puerile, very simple interest in the opposite sex. You know, maybe like looking at a girl's panties. They don't know why, but those panties are really interesting for some fascinating reason. When the girl is wearing them, of course. And sometimes not.
Yeah, or looking down somebody's top. That's a popular...
Yeah, exactly.
Because that takes me back to Dr. Stone.
Right.
I got like 3 pages in, and I'm like, this is a Boichi comic. I haven't been staring down anybody's top in 2 pages. What the hell happened?
You obviously didn't look at the color front piece to the very first issue, did you?
I didn't know there was one. Okay.
When you get a chance, go on Manga Fox and look at the very color front piece, and you will know that you're looking at a Boichi comic right away.
Okay.
But actually, this leads perfectly into the other variant of relationship stories that you'll see. Because they don't do straight-up ones. They do love comedies, and they do gang stories, which we mentioned earlier.
Oh, yeah.
And they're not as common. They were mostly an 80s, 90s thing, so they're fairly rare now, at least a pure one. But a gang story is basically about a group of young guys slowly forming a gang. And I don't usually mean a criminal gang. Usually, they're basically forming a social group. Usually, they'll start with one character meeting another character, and then they slowly meet another person, and they'll meet another person, and together, these troubled individuals who usually all have, like, issues in their lives or something like that, will together slowly sort each other's problems out. They'll usually, like, fight some other gangs or something like that. Maybe, or maybe not, it depends. Maybe they're motorcycle guys and they'll race other gangs or whatever. And they'll basically experience brotherhood and friendship. I mean, they're basically, it's like Three Musketeers type thing, right? So, all for one, one for all. They'll basically learn the meaning of that phrase. And that's what a gang story basically is. And I say that it represents this because gang stories, generally speaking, often don't even have a love interest. They literally, there might be some girls there in the background, but they're literally just in the background. They don't even bother with them because these are stories about guys bonding with each other, and they don't. No girls are allowed, man. No girls allowed.
It's that's kind of an older thing, and back in the 80s, they were literally gangs.
Yeah, they were actually.
They would be punks and who like the one everybody knows, Akira.
Yeah, that's true. Akira's an example of that. Yep.
Yeah, it's a little more seinen than you'd have, but even then, back in the 80s, a lot of the even the shonen stuff was a little edgier and a little darker, and I think it's just because, I think prior to Dragon Ball Z perfecting the formula, you had more overlap, and I think that might be why, like, say, the gang stuff kind of went into remission because it tended to be a little darker and a little heavier than what we would now call a shonen book. So when that shonen formula got perfected in the 90s, that kind of went elsewhere.
Right.
And then it kind of petered out because you don't see...
Actually, you're not quite right. There is a gang story running in Shonen Jump right now. In fact, there's one been running for 20 years. It's called One Piece.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
When I did my analysis of the gang story, by the way, for each of these meta genres, I've got like 10-page write-ups about all their details and their tropes and everything else in the book. So we're just going over some of the basic ideas. If you want to check it out, check out my book, folks. Plug. But One Piece, I realized reading it that One Piece it's a fighting battle manga gang story is what it is. Because it totally follows the gang story structure, which is basically two characters meet, and they slowly meet other people, and slowly form a gang, and together they are strong. They're misfits, but together they're stronger and can kind of overcome the world around them.
Yeah, because that's One Piece. Yeah, because there's a lot of them that I think are similar, but I'd be inclined to call it more a menagerie story than to get, because that was like your Naruto. Bleach kind of gets where you've got like your team together, but they're not
that. No, I would argue they are still there to support the main character, though.
Yeah,
One Piece is a gang story. It's about the whole cast.
Yeah, like that's. I think. I'd consider it's not the menagerie one like you get now. Right. I would say that. Yeah, that's probably. Yeah, it's probably closest to like the old gang comics that you used to get.
It really is. If you read my write-up about gang stories and such, you'll see it's a gang story. And again, I didn't even realize that when I started doing the analysis of gang stories until I looked back and said, "Oh my crap, this is One Piece." And it also has to do with one of the ways that the progression is structured. Most shonen comics have some kind of progression built into them, especially like fighting ones. It's obvious the characters learning new superpowers and stuff like that, and learning funky moves. Or getting new cards or whatever. But one of the tricks of gang stories is the way they function is the character is picking up new friends. Yeah. And that's where the character's power is growing, is the fact that they're picking up new friends. And that's one of the real ways you can measure a gang story is by the fact that it's about the group that's slowly forming. In this case, Luffy says it right from the beginning. He's going to be the pirate king, and he needs to form his pirate crew. And every single One Piece story arc is literally just about how someone joins the crew.
Yeah.
If you read them all, every single arc ends with someone joining their crew. So it's really all about how a character is introduced and how they join the crew. There's one or two little exceptions where he plays with that formula a bit, but for the most part, that's how they all end in one form or another. And so there you go. Now, there are a few other manga meta-genres, but these are kind of what I'd call the more minor ones, in the sense that they tend to be combined with something else rather than kind of stand more on their own. I'll just quickly go through them. There's what I call the transformative teacher stories. This is literally exemplified by, for example, Great Teacher Onizuka. There's also Goku-sen, Hell Teacher Nube, and most recently there's one called Assassination Classroom. Yeah. And what these are is basically they're about a new weird teacher comes into a classroom, usually a class filled with misfits and teenagers who have troubles in their lives, and basically slowly sorts everyone in the class out. But usually, even though they're incredibly weird and wacky in some way, or like a misfit, like Great Teacher Onizuka, for example, he's a gangster. He's like a biker gang kid from hell, but he's decided to kind of reform and become a teacher. And he goes to teach at this horrible reform school, and then he begins using his background to start sorting each of the students out. And the way the stories play out, one key to these things is they're actually a form of procedural mystery, where what's happening is each story is about a troubled student, and they're a puzzle to be solved by the teacher. And what we're watching is the students of the class slowly get transformed by this teacher who they always hate at the beginning, but by the end of it, they always love him. Yeah,
that's a genre that we have in North America.
Well, yes, that would be, was it?
To Sir With Love.
There it is. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
I kept thinking of like Mr. Phibbs or something like that. But it's
because there's a billion of them.
Yeah,
like that.
To Sir With Love. There's tons of them, and we do them, but we don't do them as a series. We do them usually as movies. There was Welcome Back, Kotter, but again, the problem with that is it was a sitcom, so he couldn't really transform them. He couldn't really change them. If I remember right, because you didn't want them to change because these characters are supposed to stay the same. So because we like episodic TV, we don't do transformative teachers properly except as movies, but we do have it. You're right.
Yeah, there's like bajillions of them.
So imagine a story like that, except that every story arc of the story is about a different student and how the weird teacher transforms their life in some way. Okay? And usually there's actually one of the students who is usually the biggest doubter of them all, plays kind of like the sidekick to the weird teacher. And it's often from their point of view. And we're watching it go through. Great Teacher Onizuka, also known as GTO, or my favorite is Goku-sen, which is kind of the female version of Great Teacher Onizuka, where she's like a mafia princess, Yakuza princess. And she just wants to be a school teacher. I don't know, have you ever seen Goku-sen?
I think I have a while ago.
There's an animated version of it, and there was a live-action version of it, which I really loved. And again, she basically, she uses her resources to help sort some of her students out, but she's really passionate. She loves her students, but they don't realize that she's basically the queen of hell. And it's actually pretty cool. That plays that well. The next type of minor meta-genre, again, this one tends to be mixed with other things usually, is harem stories, where we're going to see a character that's introduced. Now, a harem story, generally speaking, there's a catch with this one. These are almost seinen stories. They actually lean almost more towards the seinen side than the shonen side, but sometimes you will see them in shonen, so that's why I include it in the book. A harem story, for those who are not familiar, is a story where a male lead character ends up slowly collecting girlfriends, usually a whole bunch of them, and he helps them with their lives in one form or another, and they start hanging out with him. And it's kind of like a gang story, except instead of making buddies, you end up with a whole bunch of wives instead. And all of them are competing to be his quote unquote number one and his real wife in one form or another. And usually each story is going to be almost is some kind of, not exactly mystery, but it's something where he basically he helps the girl in some way, and so because he helps that girl, she becomes interested in him, and she usually ends up living with him or moving in near someplace close to him and becoming part of his life. And then another one that happens to, and he just slowly keeps building them up.
I was going to say, this is another one that we actually have in North America.
We do?
Yeah.
Okay, give me an example.
The easiest way to explain it is Archie. It's Archie.
Well, wait a sec, though. Archie only has technically 2 girlfriends, maybe 3 at most, if you count Cherry Blossom. Okay.
No, because it's if you've read like any of the Archie comics from like say the 60s to now,
right?
No, any time there's like a new girl in Riverdale, she runs into Archie and always falls for him, and then the rivalry between like him and Reggie to win her over. Oh, it always.
I read a lot of Archie comics. I don't quite remember it playing out that way. It usually is still just Betty and Veronica, and occasionally, like Cheryl Blossom, sorry, not Sherry Blossom, but Cheryl Blossom, and there was 1 or 2 others that were interested, but they never played a big role like Betty and Veronica do. It mostly is just a battle between them.
Yeah, but that's because the rest of them tend to disappear.
Oh, there is that. Whereas it a proper
into that landfill outside of Riverdale.
That would be the new Riverdale series on the CW, which is a dramatic, dark murder mystery type series. So yes, that would actually be that one. Yes, imagine if every girl that fell for Archie basically moved in like to his neighborhood and was constantly chasing him around or trying to move in with him or stuff like that. So we had Betty, Veronica, Cheryl, and like 5 or 6 others by the end trying to move in with him. That's actually a harem story, at least a pure one anyway. The trick is in shonen ones, what you'll usually get is what's called a kind of a not a mix, kind of, I don't want to call it a mixed harem story, but kind of a partial harem story, where the main character will start picking up a whole bunch of girlfriends that will follow him around, but he's not actually usually interested in any of them romantically exactly. They just keep following him around because they like him, but he's kind of oblivious to them usually. And that's usually how it goes, some version of that. There's one called Gate, which is a one about a soldier who goes off to another land. They find a gate to a fantasy world, opens in Tokyo, and so they send an army unit through. And it's actually a pretty cool story. It's basically Japanese Self-Defense Force porn is what it is. And I mean porn not in the sexual sense, but in the look at the really cool stuff sense. But anyway, but he ends up meeting all these like fantasy. He meets a wizard girl, elf girl. There's a whole bunch of them, and they all start following him around and basically become his team. And so that's an example of what I'm talking about. He doesn't directly have a romantic relationship with them, but he's got them around him anyway. And so that's an example of like a partial harem story where there's this exploration element and everything, an action element, but there's also kind of a harem element that's happening. And so it's kind of slipped in. Another genre, just quickly to go through them, there's only 1 or 2 more, that's very, very popular is what I call the hunted hero genre.
Okay.
The hunted hero genre is here, I can give you 2 classic examples, 3, and you'll understand what I'm saying. Okay? Space Cruiser Yamato, Macross, and Mobile Suit Gundam.
Oh, okay.
Now you got it. All right? So we've got there are stories usually where the character and usually his friends or special vehicles or whatever are basically being pursued around by some large force that's trying to hunt them down. And in the process of being chased around by this large enemy, they slowly build allies, they slowly get stronger, they slowly get more powerful, until they're eventually, at the end of the story, able to turn around, work with their enemies, and defeat whatever the enemy is that's been chasing them all along. And so that's why I call them hunted hero stories. Because usually they're being hunted by some larger force or some other force of one kind or another. Even there are examples. Samurai Jack, for example, in the American stuff, it's a hunted hero story. The new Voltron it's running on Netflix, is a hunted hero story. You can think of them as a small band of rebels against the Empire. That's a hunted hero story usually. If the Empire is chasing them around, that is. And actually, the Star Wars Rebels series that's just running, the animated one, that's a hunted hero story too. So these are very common, oddly enough, in science fiction for some reason. Japanese science fiction stories are very often hunted hero stories, as I'd call them.
Right.
I guess it's just a really good trope. It kind of works well. There's always an evil empire chasing them around, and they slowly have to build the parts for their machine or get better and get skilled and whatever else. And the individual stories often play out as a kind of battle manga, with the characters facing new and ever more powerful foes as they work their way to the top. So the enemy is constantly sending new enemies to try to catch them, new lieutenants. And they have to defeat these new lieutenants again and again until as they get more and more powerful. And eventually they can turn on the enemy and face the great Emperor down. And yeah, it's Star Wars. Yeah, it's Star Wars. I probably should have just said that from the beginning. I get the hunted hero genre actually from believe it or not, from the legend of the Japanese story Yoshitsune. Okay? Who's the original classic Japanese hunted hero. Kurosawa did a movie about him called The Man Who Tread the Tiger's Tail. For those who aren't familiar, Yoshitsune was a semi-legendary samurai. He was a real person, though, who lived, give or take, about 800 years ago. He helped his brother, Yoritomo, basically conquer Japan and establish the first shogunate in Japan. Okay? So after he helped his brother, the brothers had lived separately, as Yoshitsune had been raised up in the mountains for various reasons. You'd have to read history to understand why. He comes down, so he's really strong and powerful, and he's like really capable, and some people attribute like him having superpowers almost. So he and his buddies come down from the mountains. They help Yoritomo establish the shogunate, and the very first thing that happens is, as soon as this great new Japanese empire is established, Yoritomo's other lieutenants basically say, because they're jealous, they basically say, Yoshitsune is so powerful, he's going to overthrow you if you leave him around. And Yoritomo, being the paranoid idiot that he is, says, you're right, I should get rid of my brother. But his brother hears about this, and so his brother goes on the run, Yoshitsune goes on the run, being chased by what's basically the new shogunate that he helped establish. And so I consider that kind of the first Japanese hunted hero story. There might be another earlier legend that goes with it. And so this is where, and so he gets chased all over Japan, and unlike the anime manga version, spoiler, it does not end well. Although it depends on which end you believe, because there's actually several possible endings. We don't know how it really turned out. We know how historians think it turned out, but there are actually a few legendary versions of it that were happier endings for poor Yoshitsune. So, yeah. And then there's two more. The second last meta genre that's worth noting is, and again, one that's not very popular anymore, but it still pops up from time to time, is what I call the monster fighter genre. And this is Sentai, basically. Sentai, Kamen Rider, Bao, Sailor Moon. I mean, there's once upon a time, even technically Mazinger Z, they did a ton of these. Gatchaman, 8-Man, Giant Robo. These are the ones where a hero with or a group of heroes get together and fight monsters of the week, basically. Or they fight a series of monsters that are usually represent a villain that's trying to take over the world or something like that.
Right.
And that's the monster fighters meta genre. Again, not really popular anymore, except in Sentai live action stuff. Like, you won't really see that in comic books almost at all. But back in the 80s and 70s, you would see it, but not anymore. And then the very last meta genre that I identified was gag manga, of course. Because this is the yonkoma, or 4-panel gag manga, that tend to run... Again, I don't talk a lot about them because they're fairly straightforward, but they're the Japanese version of the comic strip, basically. And there's a few standards that pop up, so I thought I'd make a note about them. Sometimes, I should say, you will see them in modern shonen manga. They almost use them as filler. Sometimes they'll do little gag mangas at the end of regular stories. So there'll be a chapter of Naruto, for example, and then there'll be one page just like one or two 4-panel gag manga, basically, that are just the main character jokes about the main characters of the story or something like that. And so they'll throw those in. They do
that. The Tankobons usually have a couple pages of those at the end.
I often think that they include those kind of as an extra bonus material for the people who buy the Tankobon. I don't think they're part of the original, published material.
No, you don't. Well, not very, very often. Occasionally they do, or what you'll get is you see in a Tankobon as well that I think draws from that. They'll do like the chapter breaks. We'll have like a 1 or 2 panel gag or like a comedic illustration or something relating to the last chapter.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yep, they'll do something like that. But They usually don't stand on their own in the manga. Although I have seen one. There's one that I've been reading called Aho Girl, which basically means like idiot girl. And it's one, if you can look it up, there's English translations of it kicking around. And it's one that's, I don't know, it's been running in a shonen one. I think it's basically a romantic comedy about this really, really stupid girl. Who's like determined to like win the love of the boy next door, except the boy next door just finds her frickin' annoying because she's just so dumb. And and so, I mean, when I say dumb, I mean she's the kind of person who, if she, and this is an actual story, so this will give you an example. So like, there's a point where she's talking with one of her friends, okay, and her friend, her friend is so bored he just gets up and leaves. And a dog wanders over and sits where her friend was, and she turns around in the middle of her speech to tell her friend that she loves him, and sees the dog. But instead of being upset that her friend left, she thinks her friend has turned into the dog, and like is now freaking out about how she can turn him back into a human and everything like that. And it's like, and the thing is, there's no magic in the story or anything like that. She just is that dumb that she's like thinks stuff like that. Anyway, silly stuff like that. So that'll give you an idea. The 4-panel gag manga are they're comic strips. If you've read a newspaper comic like Peanuts or anything else, you know what they are. That's exactly Garfield, that kind of thing. They have an extra panel, which gives them a little more breathing room in some ways to develop the story as much as you can in 4 panels, but it gives you more than... so it gives them a little more to work with. But yeah, that's generally it. And actually, I should identify something else. That actually gives me a good opportunity, in fact, to describe something else I observed about Japanese comics, is that they use a very different story structure than Western ones do. The main difference, really, between the story structure that they use and the ones that we use is, they use what's called a story structure called the Kisho Tenketsu, which is each part of that weird word that you just heard me say, is actually each syllable represents a different part. So I'll break it down. Ki means introduction. Sho means development. Ten means like twist or turn. And ketsu basically means like resolution. Okay? And what I did is, in the book, I realized that's really hard for people to remember. So I sat down and I thought about it, and I basically translated it like this. I actually refer to it as the idea structure, okay? Just to simplify things. So idea, introduction, development, event, apex. I used apex because I couldn't come up with a better word that started with A to make the whole idea acronym work. I confess, folks. That's why I'd say. But apex actually does work. It really does work, and I'll tell you why. As you can probably guess how the different parts go. The introduction introduces the characters, sets up the situation. The development, basically, the characters start on their journey, whatever that journey is, whatever they're trying to accomplish. Event is basically stuff happens. And the key with events is stuff happens that will generate some kind of reaction from the reader, not the characters. Now, stuff can happen to the characters, but the key is it's generating a reaction from the reader. Like it's making them feel curious or making them feel happy or sad or whatever. Basically, stuff happens that's interesting to the character as they're trying to accomplish whatever their goal is or whatever they're trying to do. And eventually, things reach their apex where everything comes together and the situation is resolved. Okay? And so that's the idea structure, which is my transliteration of the Kisho Tenketsu structure that the Japanese use. And that's the short version. I spend like a dozen pages breaking it down and what happens in each step and everything like that. Because I'm making it very simple, but I do lay it out in my book. For example, I lay out all the different kinds of events and how it can all come together and everything. I try to be fairly detailed about the thing, and I try fairly comprehensive because I want the audience to understand, exactly how this all works and what's involved. But at its heart, it's really, really simple. It's a super simple story structure. You introduce the problem, the characters try to solve the problem, stuff happens, and eventually they get a result. Ta-da. Okay. And that's pretty much what any story is, right? I mean, even the standard story structure we use, the 3-act structure in the West, is introduction, stuff happens, result. I mean, that's really what
Right.
it is, okay? The Japanese pretty much just take that introduction phase and break it into the true introduction, introduce the characters, and the development phase, which is basically the characters start trying to accomplish their goal, and we do a bunch of setup where we introduce the challenges, we introduce the obstacles, we introduce the opposition, we introduce the different things that they're going to come to challenge the character later on that they're going to deal with in the event phase. And this is actually how the Japanese write it. And I didn't, this is based on not only my own observations, but also actual research. Like there's a book called Manga in Theory and Practice by Hirohiko Araki, who is the creator of the manga JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. And I read his book, and he talks about this, among other things. I knew this already, but he talks about, in his book, about how this is the standard story structure that manga use. Pretty much all manga use from some version of this. And now, some of you, just to pause here, might have heard some tale. There's a story floating around that the Kisho Tenketsu structure, this structure, is actually a story without conflict. Like you'll hear this referred to by reverent story nerds as, oh, it's this mysterious Japanese story structure that has, like, characters don't conflict with each other. Everyone lives in peace, and it's just about interesting story, events happen and stuff. And they're half right, in the sense that it's a story structure where you don't have to have anything violent or conflict-based happen, but you can if you want to. Okay? That's the thing. It's not baked into the structure. Like, the way Americans usually use their story structure, the 3-act structure, the American version of it has a bunch of conflict built into it. You'd have to go read more about the 3-act structure, but if you do read especially the version that Hollywood uses, actually has things like called a pinch point and false victories and a low point where the character feels defeated and then has to like stand back up again and like fight for what they believe in. And there's a whole reason for that we can talk about in another podcast. I'm not going to go into it now. But the American 3-act Hollywood structure generally has a conflict built into it. It pretty much requires the character to be in conflict with someone or something. Whereas the Kisho Tenketsu idea structure doesn't. It just requires interesting stuff to happen. And I give this example in my book, okay? So, for example, you could do a Kisho Tenketsu structure where it's literally about a character cleaning their house, okay? And maybe as the character is cleaning their house, that's their goal. The character's whole goal is cleaning the house, and that's all the character does in the whole story. But as they're cleaning their house, the audience is watching or seeing that, for example, she lifts up a vase, and why is there a finger under that vase? And then she lifts up, and she's cleaning this part, and there's another body part over there. And then eventually you come to realize that you're in the house of like some like werewolf or something like that. And so the character literally only cleans their house. There's no conflict there in the sense that that's but the audience is seeing all these like events happen. It's like, holy crap, look at that. Holy crap, look at that. That's so weird. Oh my God, look at that thing. But those are the ways that the audience is reacting. Like you're giving the audience things to react to. You're not requiring that the character has this conflict about, oh my God, what should I do? Should I lift that up? Or should I be a werewolf? Or should I not? Or should I eat people or not? Stuff like that. That would be the American version. Whereas the Japanese one will just be about the characters going about their life, or could be. I've never read a manga that just did this. I don't think. Maybe I have. I've read so many over the years, it's hard to tell. But that'll give you an idea about what I mean by when I say it's a plot structure without conflict. Okay?
You know what's weird about that, though? As kind of an odd step to the left.
Right, yeah.
We write stories like that too, but we're not taught to think of stories in that term, because what we tend to the definition of type of story, and I forget the technical term for this, that we're taught here in like the West and North America to categorize your stories in terms of the conflict, and the conflict is the old man versus man. Man versus nature, man versus self.
Thanks, Aristotle.
Yeah, and we're taught to frame the story off as a conflict right from the beginning, even though we don't necessarily, like, we write that kind of story, like the Japanese style too, but we tend not to envision how we do things in those terms.
Yes.
That's really, really kind of odd.
It is actually, yeah, it is. And that's one of the things I found fascinating about writing this book and researching it, but coming to understand exactly how the idea structure, the Kisho Tenketsu structure works. And in understanding that, it's actually given me a new understanding of how the American stuff works as well. Like, I can now see the conflict base to the American structure. I knew it was there before, but it's truly helped me understand it by giving me something to compare with. And it's just a very different way of looking at story, and so that's been one of the joys actually of doing this project, and one of the things I've actually really found fascinating about it. And I had to spend a lot of time thinking about it. I went through a lot of revisions thinking about exactly how it all works, and then I would do more research and take more notes and come up with, if anything, the section about plot in the book, which is mostly about the structure and such, was probably the hardest thing to write in this entire book, and took the most work out of all of it. Even though it's just one chapter, about 22 pages, it still took a lot of work to write, because I had to not just think about how the structure works, but also come up with ways to explain it to a Western audience so that they would hopefully understand it. And that's why I spend so much time breaking it down and working with it and giving examples, etc. Actually, I'll give you another example. There's actually one of my, this is odd, but it's an actual comic. It's called Yuru Camp. And it's one of my favorite manga that I'm reading right now, one of my favorite translated manga. And I will tell you, you're not going to believe me when I tell you this, but I will tell you what it's about. It is about a couple of high school girls who have competing ideas about off-season camping. Okay, that's the whole concept of the, and the one high school girl thinks that it's best that camping be done with your friends, and the other high school girl thinks that camping is the best done as a solo competition, as just not competition, but as something you do by yourself. And it's best done solo. Now, this is off-season camping, which means going up into the mountains when it's cold and wet, and making a little campsite and just sitting there around a fire and enjoying yourself and cooking food and like sleeping and going to and seeing beautiful sights. That's what the whole thing is about. There is zero conflict in the whole thing. In fact, the only conflict is that there is a very, very slight and subtle philosophical difference between these two girls who are friends. They kind of meet at the beginning in the first chapter. They meet, and then they're both having their own camping experiences, and they're kind of comparing them with each other. But neither one is actively challenging the other one. Just both of them have different ideas about camping. Off-season camping. Okay? And like the most recent one was one of the girls got this little fold-out stove that you can take. It folds down to a book, but apparently you can fold it out. It turns into a little stove that you can take with you for camping. You can put wood in it, and it turns into and you can cook meat on top of it and stuff. And the whole chapter was pretty much about the potential ways she could just use this little device. And talking with another character about it. It's like, oh, we could do this with it, and we could do that with it. And you know something, though? It's so damn beautiful and charming that I can't stop reading this thing. It's kind of like the golf one, except it's just a different approach. And yet it's one of those things that I have almost never seen anyone not Japanese write. Like, it's something that's just so utterly unique. But it exemplifies the whole Kisho Tenketsu ethos, where there's this emphasis just on, yeah, stuff just happens, but as long as it's interesting to the reader and presented in an interesting way, it's all good, man. And and of course it has beautiful artwork to accomplish it. So that's one of the things that is the key with the Japanese comic. Often when I say event, of course, and is events are about making the reader feel something. That actually also can be the art doing it too. It doesn't just have to be a story event. It can also be the artist presented in a beautiful way, like a beautiful shot of something. That's an event too, because the reader sees that shot of the guy with his spatula pointing across the kitchen at his opponent or something like, and thinks, wow, that looks pretty cool. Congratulations, that's an event. Okay?
Right.
Events can come in many forms. I refer to it as an event because it's something that happens that causes a reaction from the reader in some way, whether it's emotional or intellectual or whatever. And I go to that more detail in the book. And so that's just a different way of constructing stories. And I find it fascinating, actually. I mean, now I truly understand how the Japanese kind of put their stuff together and why it does feel differently than the American stuff does.
Right.
And it's so putting together this book, I have to say, has been a great experience overall. I mean, it's taken me almost a year of my life, and in focus as a book, it's taken me about 6 months of my life. But no, actually, I mean, it's been a truly rewarding experience that in the sense that I've learned so much about storytelling and different ways to approach characters and drama. It made me think a lot more about the relationship between the audience and the story and how they interact with each other. I mean, something people forget is that a story is a partnership. It's all about knowing what's in your audience's heads and then taking that and working with your audience to produce a reaction. If your audience if you don't understand your audience, you're not going to be able to get them to react properly, and it's going to be very hard to actually tell them a satisfying story. Like, you need to know what your audience is going to get out of this story. Are they going to get like a new perspective that they haven't seen before? Are they going to learn some skills? Are they going to learn some knowledge? Are they going to get something new? Are they going to see something new that they've never seen before? Or is it just going to be about making them feel something or emotion? What are you going to be giving your audience? And that's really important. I mean, that's important to know. And if you don't know how to connect that with your audience and give your audience what's going to satisfy them and what they want, you're not going to be a very good storyteller.
Yeah.
And so that was a big part of it, and thinking about setting in different ways. And I could go on. I mean, the book itself is not short. I mean, it came out a little. The great irony is when I started writing this thing, I thought, it'll be about 30, maybe 40 pages or something like that. It'll be fine. It's 300 pages, folks.
302, actually.
Depending on which version. Depending on which version you're looking at, and by which I mean different compiling of it, so for space and everything like that, there's a version that's 300, and then there's a version that's 310, depending on which ebook version. But they're all the same content. It's just the way it's formatted. It comes out differently sometimes, depending on whether you're looking at a PDF or a doc file or whatever. But at least it's about 300 pages, give or take, of pretty much everything that I could. I mean, when I wrote it, originally I just started as like, well, here are the tropes for the different Japanese comics. And then I thought, well, wait a moment, what if someone who doesn't know how to write reads this? And so I started writing how to write. And that ended up taking up, at least half the book. So half of it is me as a script writing teacher, because I've been teaching script writing for about 6 years now, and just a writer and everything, going through and conveying a lot of my knowledge and conveying a lot of what I've learned from Don, I've learned a lot from you, and there's a lot of your ideas and your thoughts are in this book as well. And our mutual friend Chad, had a lot of conversations with him, and some ideas that Chad has presented and other things are also in this book. I've thought about them and given my take on them, and I generally tried to create the book that would cover almost everything I could think of for a new writer, but also an experienced writer could get something from it, and almost anyone can in some way, form. And if you just want to learn about Japanese comics and everything, well, I got you covered for that too. I kind of cover a little bit of everything. I mean, I even have a sample manga in the back where I take everything that I put together and give an example, a original quote-unquote manga that I've put together. It's about ninjas that I put together to show how how you would put together a fighting manga with characters and everything else. And I've got chapters on how to use all of this material knowledge and how to use it to assemble something like what goes in the sample section and everything else. So, and finally, I top it off with just comments about the comic industries and how to get your stuff published and how to what to do with all this stuff. Because of course, I wrote this not just for comic artists, but also for anyone who wants to write these types of stories or anything like this. And now that was a bit tricky, and I did that. I know Don may not agree with this, but and I do say that right at the beginning of the book. I tell people straight up front that I'm not an artist, right? And I realized that writing comics, half of it is about understanding art and how to convey your story through art. But the core story stuff can still be looked at separately from the artwork itself. But if you truly want to be a great comic artist, you do have to actually understand the artistic side also. And I do say that right in my introduction, like, this book is meant to more be a companion piece to something like, say, Scott McCloud's Making Comics, for example, or Eisner's Comics and Sequential Art. If you want the art side and to truly understand how to integrate it, that you kind of should also read those books as well. You know, I don't make it, and if that's what people are, if you're just looking for the art stuff, this is not the book for you. And I actually have a note right at the beginning that says that, and I'll tell anyone who's reading that this is not the art book, but it's the book that understands, it's the art, it's the writing book and the philosophy book and everything else that's except for the art book, basically.
Yeah, because you did something with this book that I don't think anyone else has ever done.
Oh, God, I hope so. What is it?
You wrote a book about writing comics.
Right. Okay.
Nobody talks about writing comics.
They don't?
It's always, here's how the art works. Well, that's great, but that's half of the story. And
you're right, actually. I mean, I read a number of books about writing comics, but they're all more art focused than story focused.
Yep. And the problem with that, because no matter what your art form is, I'm a firm believer that you have to put the work into the theory. You have to have it's not just the mechanical skill. You don't just learn, here's how to write Save the Cat. You know, you don't just learn, here's how to lay panels out, you know, comics and sequential art. You have to kind of have that theory. Why do we do this? Why does this work? Why does this turn out like this? If I wanted to do this, how does that work? And what you've done by writing a book about writing comics, which nobody's done before, you've done that theory.
Right.
And I think that's the big value of your book, is that you've got all the underpinning ideas. Like, even though you're talking about a very specific genre, how that specific genre works is you're in, because a lot of the principles and how you outline, they do this because of this, you can, if you're on the ball, you can extrapolate that into other things.
Yep. Well, that's my intent.
Like,
yeah.
Yeah, this is the book on the theory of how comic books work through specifically shonen style comics.
Yep, I would agree with that statement. I'm going to accept your praise and your comments. I have no problems with this. And that's kind of what I was, I guess, in the end, trying to accomplish. Right? I mean, I wrote this as a book that I want to share my knowledge that I put together with other writers so they could hopefully make use of it and could hopefully write their own stories. I mean, obviously that's what it's intended for. And I've met so many artists. In fact, I meet them all the time. People who are like, say, I love to draw comics, but I suck at stories. Like, over and over again. I've been asked by many, many artists actually, like, can you help me by writing stories? And my answer is generally always, no, sorry, too busy. It's not, and there are many reasons, but usually I really am too busy, actually. I have done it a few times. I've actually worked with a few artists, and it's been a great experience. But usually I'm too busy working on other things or doing other things. But the thing is, this in part is my book for them. Like, my book where I say, okay, well, here's how it's done so you can write your own stories. I mean, even Scott McCloud's Making Comics, I would say that is one of its flaws. It's still more focused on the art side of it than the actual story theory side of it. That's what keeps it from being an otherwise perfect book on the topic. And but yes, I will accept your high praise very happily. And yeah, it's been a great experience. It really has. I mean, I've just spent the last couple weeks getting it formatted for printing. Yes, as Don's laughing because I told him earlier about my experiences. But yes, getting this printed is proved to be a little bit tricky. And I've learned, folks, that if you decide to ever put your book to print, for God's sake, do it as a PDF. Don't try to submit it as a Microsoft Word doc file. Even though they'll tell you they can accept it, just don't do it, man. Just don't do it. You will get endless revisions sent back, basically saying, that basically, well, this doesn't work anymore. This doesn't quite fit, or wherever. No, just send it as a PDF. They can handle it. It will look exactly like you want it to and like they want it to. Just do it. Just do it that way. That's all I have to say on the subject. And so I know a little bit about marketing. I mean, at heart, this is a fairly niche book. I don't ever expect to really sell a lot of copies of it. But I'm hoping that the copies that I do sell, are appreciated by, a few people, like anyone else, really. It's a nonfiction labor of love kind of book. If it doesn't sell that many, I'm okay with that. I wrote a book that I enjoyed writing and that I hope some people get something out of. And if lots of people read it, that's awesome too. I'm kind of okay either way. As long as I just kind of contributed to the, the general pool of knowledge of the subject out there. That's my take on the whole thing. Because I'm a teacher through and through. That's just how I am. And I've put a lot of my, teaching approach and teaching knowledge and my teacher's way of explaining stuff to my students into this book. And I think that will hopefully help make it easy to understand. I have read some other books about writing in various forms. I've read a lot of books about writing, actually. And one of the problems that a lot of them run into is a lot of them are very academic. And they either are too shallow because they try to be too kind of hip and easy to understand, or from my perspective anyway, or they often are too deep and too academic, in which case they're using lots of language that makes them hard to understand. And I've tried to kind of veer towards trying to make my book as easy to understand as possible. And I maybe haven't gone into as much depth in some things as I could, but the truth is that there are certain points where if I have to choose between depth and readability and understandability, I'll choose readability and understandability over depth sometimes. That's just the way it is.
Right.
And, so there are always sacrifices whenever you're writing any book. And my final thought on the subject is two final thoughts. One, if you do write a book and submit it to Amazon, use Amazon marketing, because it's very cheap and it's actually a really good way to get your book out. And I can explain that in another show we do about doing ebook publishing or something like that. I'll explain what that means. But yeah, look into Amazon marketing. It's really handy. And the other thing is, for God's sake, if you do want to do manga, do it on your own and don't do it as part of the Japanese comic industry. If you don't try to get into the actual Japanese comic industry, because it is literally a sweatshop from hell. We went back, I made that comment about Murata being like a, master artist and everything, like just pumping out, One-Punch-Man. And that's true. But at the same time, he's got a set of assistants who I'm sure are literally worked to the bone to try to keep up with him. It's not, you're not doing it alone. And the industry requires a whole apprenticeship system and everything else. If you really want to understand it, go read Bakuman, which of course is a comic about doing comics in Japan. And here's the thing I want you to understand. In Bakuman, okay, it's romanticized. It is a romanticized version of what it's like to work in the Japanese comic industry. It's about two guys get together, they decide to become major comic artists, and they work their way up the system. It's an activity manga is what it is. And in Bakuman, the main characters nearly die of overwork several times during the story, okay? And that's...
I was going to say, it's romanticized. The one guy has to have an emergency operation because of stress or he'll die.
But that's my point. It's still the romanticized version. It's still the freaking romanticized version, and they nearly die of stress and overwork. And that's the nice version. Really. Unless you're actual Japanese, you probably don't want to try to get into the actual manga industry. I really do not recommend it. You can try, have fun. However, I will also say that this is just publishing advice that I came across. Right now, the American webcomic, as in kind of self-published webcomic industry, is still really growing. It's like Amazon has not too recently introduced a whole e-publishing system for comics. You can release graphic novels and everything through Amazon, through the web, electronic ones now, and make money doing it. There's also drive-through comics. There's lots of places where you can turn your comics into basically PDF collections, and you can put them up, and they'll sell them and promote them like everything else. And it's becoming quite a big market. So if you want to actually do comics, my advice these days is do webcomics, basically. Do webcomics, earn your stripes, and get your stuff out there. And then once you're high enough, publish them yourself or work with a small press company, because the main American companies like Marvel and DC are basically dying, so just stay the hell away from them. Unless you're feeling really masochistic, don't go near them. That's my actual advice.
Yeah, that's probably sound advice, at least at the time of recording.
Yeah, exactly. As of this point. Oh, one last thing though. If you do want to just write prose, if you want to use some of this stuff to write your epic battle manga series, but as a prose fiction, just general fiction, I would recommend Wattpad, because Wattpad's actually doing some really interesting stuff with Wattpad is an app and website which has, I've heard, roughly 30 million users. And anyone can publish on it and put stuff on it, and it's also got a social media aspect to it. Plus, you can actually make money from the advertising that's connected with your stories. So if your stories get read a lot, you actually make money from it. So they've actually managed to monetize like story publishing and such. Maybe not a lot of money, depending on, again, how people pay attention to your story, but for some people, actually a lot. Apparently, there's one woman who got like 1.5 billion reads on her one story. Now, it's a novel. Remember, when I say reads, that means every chapter would count as one read. So when you've got 30 million people and you've got... But anyway, so that's how it could get into the billions. But still, that's incredible. I can't imagine how much money she must have made from advertising if it was done back then. I heard a bunch of big publishers from the regular came and scooped her up and offered her multi-million-dollar deals. I mean, so, yeah, Wattpad's kind of the place to be right now if you want to do the web fiction thing. And it's kind of exploding. There's another one called Hooked, apparently, that's quite popular right now. But again, we can do a whole show on like e-publishing and that another time. The key point is go out and buy my book. I mean, sorry. If you are so inclined and you're interested in like learning about shonen manga and more about how manga is written and everything else, and a little bit about Japanese culture and comics theory and everything, you might consider taking a look at my book.
It's subtle.
Was that subtle enough? I mean, I was trying to do that in the most Japanese way possible.
No, you didn't apologize.
That's true. Enough, well, I was afraid I didn't want to sound too Canadian. Yeah, there we go. Okay, on that note, any final thoughts, Don, before we go?
No, I think we pretty much covered everything we can, unless people like read the book, because then we have to get into specifics.
This is exactly true, and there are 300 pages of specifics. So, also, by the way, don't let the size of the book, when I keep talking about 300 pages, like scare anyone here. I mean, it's broken down to nice, easily to understand chapters about different sections, and most of it can be read in almost any order as well. So, just read it, buy it and read it as you like, and let me know what you think. And if you really liked it, leave a review on Amazon. I'd really appreciate that too. That's the best way you can show your appreciation. But yeah, actually, or leave a comment on the website. I'd love to hear from you about that, or write to me, whatever. Anyway, so yeah, go check it out, folks. Sorry I'm being so self-serving and pushy, but I'm really proud of this book. I'm really happy with the way it turned out, and I'd like for people to actually read it and get something out of it, because I think there's something there for almost everyone. And on that note, thank you for listening, folks. I'm going to stop plugging my book now. Talk to you later, and we'll see you next time on the Department of Nerdly Affairs for something cool and awesome, and buy my book. Bye. Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya! come on over and join the conversation at obeythedna.com, where you will find show notes and more.